Okay, I'm going to cover the activities that are described in this chapter, database connection pooling. And so I'm assuming that you are reading that or have read that. I'll start up Eclipse. First thing we need to do is modify the way in which we deploy the publisher application. So the publisher x.xml file, which we already have, we have an alternative piece of XML which we're going to use for that. Alright, let's look in publisher. Here's publisher.xml, and let me just maximize that. That's working. Here it is. Just need to, the doc base will need to preserve that, so I'm just going to cut that, paste it in to the new piece of XML. So now when we deploy the publisher.xml, what we do is we configure a data source. The name of our data source will be called data source. So we have the database connection parameters in here, the username, the password, the database, port number, all that stuff that we need to connect to the database. So that's in there. And now we need to redeploy the publisher application. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'll go into installed software, Apache Tomcat. Let's start up the server. Actually, before we do that, let's just clear the logs in case we need to look at the logs. And we'll go into bin and startup.bat. Here we go. Looks good. And we'll need to go to the Tomcat Manager application. And username, I believe I called it admin. Password is admin. There we go. So let's start by undeploying the publisher application right there. And now let's redeploy. So here is the context path. It's /publisher. And now the XML configuration file. Let's get that. And I will navigate to that first in Windows Explorer, and then just copy the path. So here's my workspace folder here. This is publisher. This is the file that we want to use. I'm just going to copy that path. Alright, let's paste that in. And I'll need another slash. Actually, it just pops up right there, so I'm all set. That was from the last time I filled out the form. Let's deploy, and you need to check this message up here. It says OK. Looks like it was a success. Okay, now that that's been redeployed, we can go ahead and change these configurations. So our newsfeed servlet, what we're going to use now is this this data source, an instance of data source. Here's our newsfeed servlet. So we will access the database through this data source. Paste that in there, and we'll need to import data source. This is It's not JavaX activation, it's javax.sql. There it is. That looks good. And then what we'll do is we're going to let the outside configuration code set the data source for us. So to enable that, we add this set method called setDataSource. We pass in a data source. This method is public, so the outside code can invoke it. Whereas the data source, we don't set it directly. So we declare that as private. It's only can be accessed internally. And let's go back to the this is the current code that we use in order to get a connection. But we're going to replace that with this alternative piece of code. So we're going to, rather than getting the connection through this get connection method of the driver manager, we will get the connection through the data source. Let's go back there and do that. So here it is. Here's where we get the connection. We have our new code, and here's the old code. We can take that out. Alright, we still get a warning there. What's the warning have to do with? Oh, now this driver manager is no longer needed, so we can take that out. It's good to pay attention to the warnings. Should remove every warning if possible. And this initialization is no longer needed, because this loads this this driver. This is a piece of code that's not needed anymore. Take that out. That's the old style. And finally, we need to create a what's called a servlet context listener that does that initializes, that carries out some initialization that the application depends on. So let's take a look here. What we'll do is create a a class called init. Let's go ahead and do that. And that class will extend a servlet context listener. In fact, I'm just going to grab that right from here. Alright, let's go back to Eclipse. Here's the source. It'll be in this. I'm going to put it in the web folder. Is that how I did it in the book? Let me check that. Yeah, it's in this web publisher.web namespace. Alright, let's create that. So it'll be new class. As you can see, because I right-clicked on the package name here, and so it populated this package field entry for me. And the name of the class will be init. The superclass is going to be JavaX servlet.servlet context listener, and this looks fine. This is unknown. This should be. Oh, this shouldn't be extends. I made a mistake there. This should be implements. So that's in fact what we need to do. Like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to redo that. Well, we can do it this way as well. You know, the book, I'm not sure what I explained in there, but you see, what's going on there is that servlet context listener is an interface. It's not a class. We cannot extend an interface. We need to declare init as implementing the interface. So we could go back. The problem is we're missing these methods here, but which is not a big deal. We just grab those. Let's go ahead and grab those and take a look here. Here's the class. See, it's complaining because init does not implement the inherited abstract methods of the interface servlet context listener. So once again, we have those methods implemented in the code from the book, so we can just plug those in there. And here's some unresolved names that need to be imported. So here's initial context, that's in Java X naming, that's good. This is context, that should be Java X naming as well. Data source. And this is Java X SQL. Servlet context event. Java X servlet, that's right. Servlet context. Java X servlet as well. Let's save that file. Look for this red X. We still have an issue there. The logger. Let's import the logger. Not from Java util logging, but from org-apache.log4j. That's the namespace we want there. And we save it, and so we have a class that now compiles. So we're overriding this. Actually, we should use that annotation at override, and that's a good habit to get into. Ooh, this is not overriding anything. It's this one here. So context initialized. This method here, context initialized, is called when the web application is initialized. It's called once. This gives a chance for to carry out some initialization. And this context destroyed is also called once. That's when the web application is being shut down. And now this context initialized is takes this context initialized is not declared as throwing any exception, but the code that we want to use, such as this lookup here and this lookup, that these can throw exceptions. And so rather than having well, we could have just put that these lines of code, we could have simply have placed them in here, but to remove perhaps simplify it a little bit to make it more readable, we just call context initialize to pass in the servlet context that we get from the servlet context event object that was passed into us. And so if an exception is thrown, we write to the logger, and then we throw a runtime exception. So we can't throw this is called an unchecked exception. It's not declared as being thrown in the method here. So because this method we're overriding or implementing a method that we inherit from an interface, that we have to abide by that function signature exactly, so we're not throwing any exceptions. We need to throw what's called an unchecked exception, and the standard unchecked exception is called runtime exception. Alright, let's save this, and it seems to work. Okay, now we created this class to do the initialization. Let's look at what that initialization is. Actually, what we do is the main idea here is in our newsfeed servlet we want to set the data source. So here it is, we pass in the data source. So you need to get the data source, and what we get the data source from what's called the JNDI API, the Java naming and directory interface, and this is the, without going into the details, this is the code that does that. Well, all three of these lines. Alright, so let's close that out. But now we need to configure Tomcat so it knows that that this init class should be should have its context initialized method and context destroyed methods called at the appropriate times. Let's take a look at that. Now that is done in the web XML file. So here in WebXML we configure the newsfeed servlet. We need to, in the same manner, configure the that init class as a context listener. Let's find that. Here it is, right there. Okay, there it is. Copy. And let's go ahead and paste it. I'll put it at the top because it's related to initialization. There it is. I just cleaned this up a little bit. There it is. So publisher.web.init is configured as a listener. Let's close that. It's possible, depending on your version of Tomcat, that this may be needed. I don't believe that's needed. Let's try it without that. We'll need to stop and start the web application so that it reprocesses its web XML file, and then we'll test. Let's go ahead and do that. And we'll do that in the manager application. Okay, let's go ahead and stop the publisher application and start it again. Check the message. Okay. Now let's go ahead and check the application. We'll go to website.home, and it seems to be working. Actually, I think that I may have skipped a step when I was going through my book. This should be the newsfeed application. I'm going to check directly publisher. This is publisher / news.rss. I have that there. First time, oh, could be a problem. We have an issue there. Let's fix that. Cannot create connection to the database server. Well, that's easy to fix. I'm not running the database server, so let me go ahead and get that running. It's in program files, MySQL server. Let's get this started. MySQLd.exe. There we go. Let's reload this, and there it is. So we're now retrieving from the database. In fact, let's test that. Let's go to the database. Let's get command prompt. So MySQL minus u publisher minus password pub publisher minus d publisher, and then let's select star from news item. Alright, let's see that title. Let's do this. Let's update news item set title equals high for ID equals 1. There's an error there. What is the mistake there? ID is an int. Title, update, news, item, set. Let's see, what is the mistake there? Near for ID. Oh, is it while? It's not for, it's where. That's it. Sorry about that. And so there's hi. Let's go back to the newsfeed. I'm going to reload this. And there you can see it came up actually. There it is. The title is hi. Okay, now what I didn't do is I didn't get this this home application set up, so I must have skipped that in a previous step in the book. So I'm going to go back and fix that. But actually, everything that that needs to be done at this point is finished for this section of the book. So I'm going to end that now.